kind of difficult to be certain about most of the details of Muhammad's life because the historical sources are so late. Our earliest detailed biographical source on Muhammad's life is Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, which was written more than a century after Muhammad died. And we don't even have what Ibn Ishaq actually wrote. We only have an edited version by Ibn Hisham. And Muslims don't even pay much attention to Ibn Ishaq. The sources they used to learn about Muhammad, their main hadith collections, were written 2 to 3 centuries after he died. So we're dealing with some very late material. But if we take the Muslim sources at face value, the story of Muhammad's life goes something like this. He was born around 570 AD in a city called Mecca in what is now Saudi Arabia. His father, Abdullah, died before he was born, and his mother, Amina, died when he was 6 years old. After the death of his grandfather, Muhammad was raised by his uncle, Abu Talib, leader of the Banu Hashim clan. While he was still young, Muhammad began working in the Meccan caravan trade, which put him in contact with diverse religious traditions. When he was 25, he married a wealthy widow, Khadija, who was 15 years older than he was. With more leisure time, Muhammad developed the habit of retreating to a cave on Mount Hira for prayer and reflection, as was common for the polytheists of the Meccan Quraysh tribe. So it seems that Muhammad was very interested in religious matters long before anyone believed he was a prophet. During one of his yearly retreats, Muhammad became convinced that a jinn or a demonic spirit had possessed him and had ordered him to recite some verses. The verses said, "Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know." These words are now found in the Quran, chapter 96, verses 1 through 5. So this is when Muhammad started receiving revelations that would eventually become the Quran. But again, he didn't think that they were revelations at this point. He thought that he was possessed by some sort of poetry demon. He was 40 years old at the time, and he was so embarrassed at the thought of being possessed by a jinn or a demon that he tried to hurl himself off a cliff. But whatever it was that gave him the verses stopped him from committing suicide. Muhammad ran home to his wife Khadija and her cousin Waraka, and it was Khadija and Waraka who persuaded him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of Allah. Muhammad soon began preaching Islam to friends and family members and later to the public. But his messages became increasingly inflammatory. He condemned the religious beliefs of the polytheists of Mecca and he mocked their gods. Not surprisingly, the Meccans eventually started persecuting Muhammad and his followers. And after his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib died, Muhammad decided to flee the city of Mecca. His new city, Medina, was a little over 200 miles north of Mecca. After forming alliances with various non-Muslim groups, Muhammad began robbing the Meccan caravans. These attacks eventually led to a series of battles with Mecca, the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and the Battle of the Trench. As war booty poured in, so did new converts. The growing Muslim army allowed Muhammad not only to subdue Mecca, but to subdue the rest of Arabia as well. Unfortunately for Muhammad, after attacking a Jewish settlement at Khaybar, a Jewish woman whose family had been killed by Muslims offered to cook dinner for Muhammad and some of his companions, and the Prophet of Islam accepted her offer. But the food she gave him was poisoned. Muhammad spit the food out, but according to Muslim sources, the poison caused some sort of internal damage, which led to severe pain and ongoing medical problems. Muhammad suffered an agonizing death a few years later in 632. So to put all of this together, we can divide Muhammad's life into 3 main periods. There's the time before he claimed to be a prophet. This would be 570 to 610. There's his time in Mecca after he claimed to be a prophet. This is 610 to 622. And there's his time in Medina as a prophet. This is 622 until his death in 632.
Hi everyone and welcome, this is the Apostate Prophet. When talking about Islam, especially if someone is newly introduced to Islam, there is always this question: who wrote the Quran? How did it come into existence? The answer is not very simple. A short Islamic answer to the question is that the Quran is the direct spoken word of Allah, who is almighty, all-knowing, and omnipresent according to Islamic belief. Muslims believe that Allah spoke his word directly through Gabriel to Muhammad, who then revealed it to his followers. But in reality, it went through a huge and questionable process. I want to go through that process with you, provide some information, but also look at it from a critical, skeptic perspective. The actual Islamic belief, held by the vast majority of Islamic scholars, is as follows. Muhammad was a merchant in Mecca, Arabia, in the 6th and 7th centuries. For a while, he had dreams that reportedly came true in reality, which no one can prove, of course, and he loved going to a cave called Hira and retreating for a while, whereafter he would go to Khadija, his employer and wife, to discuss his spiritual activities that he claimed he had. One day in the cave, in 610, when he was 40, he was suddenly visited by the angel Gabriel, who told Muhammad to read. Muhammad said, "I can't read," so Gabriel squeezed him and told him again to read. At this time Muhammad was like, "I can't read, what am I supposed to read?" And Gabriel squeezed him again so hard that Muhammad was overwhelmed, and Gabriel recited the first verses of the Quran. Recite in the name of your Lord, who created men from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught men that which he knew not. These 5 verses are believed to be the first revelation and are in today's Quran in chapter 96. The chapter has more verses than that, but those are believed to have been revealed at a later time. During Muhammad's entire lifetime, there was no book called the Quran. The Quran was only verbally revealed by Muhammad, verse by verse, depending on what he had to deal with currently, and it was written down and memorized by people around him. Muhammad would praise people who memorized the Quran and would give others the duty to do so. That's why more and more people who trusted him memorized his words, which he claimed were from Allah. That's why memorizing the Quran is still seen as a very honorable and pious thing to do in Islam, although it had no special meaning in other contemporary cultures like the Romans, and has no big importance in today's time, where you have little gods in your pockets. Only when Muhammad died did his followers come together and decided to compile all the Quran verses and turn it into one book. There were hundreds of people who memorized parts of the Quran, and dozens of people who wrote down Quran verses, dozens of scribes who had separate written parts of the Quran. The Sunni belief is that hundreds of those who memorized it were killed in a battle after Muhammad's death, under first Caliph Abu Bakr's rule, and that Umar, who would later become the second Caliph, urged Abu Bakr to compile the Quran. Abu Bakr then gave a man called Zayd ibn Thabit, who was Muhammad's scribe, the mission to compile all verses that were scattered among scribes. In a narration, Zayd says that this was an almost impossible thing to do. And the hadith also points out that Muhammad never ordered or did such a thing. According to vastly approved evidence, Muhammad never explicitly stated the idea to compile all the Quran verses into one book. Zayd did his best and collected everything he found, even from the memorizers. And he put together this collection with the help of few other people. From an objective point of view, especially among historians, you would never trust the authenticity of something that was brought together by one person from completely unknown origins and then later on turned into a huge book by again multiple other people. Considering that we are talking about Arabia in the 600s, it's even less credible, because Arabia didn't have a history of credible reports and books. But in Islam, you could view this as a miracle, because it's certainly not believable, it's certainly not trustworthy. And by adding this Quran verse, you have to believe that it was a miracle. Indeed, it is He who sent down the Quran, and indeed it is He who will be its guardian. That's not all. According to Islamic belief, even after this happened, there was not one single form of the Quran. There were so many different ones, with verses varying among the owners. Also, Arabic was not a strong and unitary language. There were many different dialects and ways to read a text, and since Arabic didn't have very well outlined rules back then, the scribes and the readers had their own versions of the Quran. That's why a task was initiated, most probably by Uthman, the third caliph, to unify the Quran by creating one canonized form of the Quran which would overrule all other Qurans. The purpose was to create specifications of vowels and diacritical points in accordance with one specific dialect of Arabic, so that the Quran cannot be understood differently by reading it differently. Because in Arabic, a word can be spelled the exact same way, but can have a different outcome as meaning depending on how you read it. Look at this, for example. All of these are spelled the same way, but have different meanings. The vowel indicators and diacritics define the meanings. Uthman wanted to prevent this and created a final canonized supreme version of the Quran and ordered to burn all other copies. According to Islam, not all of the copies were burned, because some refused to burn the copies and others just went unnoticed. That's why there are still different versions of the Quran alive today, which contradicts with the common Islamic belief that Allah's word can't be changed. I mean, Allah's word can't stay unchanged if Allah's word is different in every text to begin with, right? Some who know about this suggest that the differences were very little and insignificant, but that's not true. The different ways of reading the Quran can change the meaning minimally or very much. Most Muslims only trust in the current version of the Quran because that one was declared by Uthman to be supreme, a human, a regular Muslim and political ruler, 20 years after Muhammad's death. That's why Islamic teachers prefer not to teach their Muslim students transparently and clearly about this, but that's why you have me. This was basically the history of the Quran summarized in its vastly accepted form by the consensus of Islamic scholars. As for why the Quran is not in chronological order, Muslims don't have a clear answer on that. But most of them agree that Muhammad was the person who told his followers to rearrange the chapters of the Quran. As you know by now, Muhammad would just speak and his followers would make notes. According to the general belief, Muhammad would speak the verses and then tell his scribes that what he just said goes in this or that chapter. Some chapters and verses were also put together by Uthman and others independently. Most importantly, the chapter of repentance, which is the 9th chapter of the Quran, is not only the most dangerous and aggressive one, it is also one that has no clear beginning and was just placed where it is by Muhammad's surviving companions. According to a hadith, Uthman didn't know what to do with the verse, because Muhammad used to give them further instructions about where to place verses, but Muhammad died before he could give them any instructions about this one. So the Muslims didn't put a beginning line to this chapter and placed it somewhere where it would be similar to surrounding verses. Doesn't sound like an almighty God's plan at all, right? This is the Islamic scholarly consensus, I'm not making this up. Muhammad died in the middle of the process, and that's supposed to be Allah's plan. That's it. To make it short, all that is how the Quran came into existence. Today it has 114 chapters and 6,236 verses. Verses that were allegedly spoken by Almighty God through his angel to a merchant in Arabia, who then revealed all these verses to his scribes in the Arabian desert in the 7th century. But the question was, who wrote the Quran, right? If you follow Islam blindly, the answer is Allah wrote it, sort of. If you don't follow the Quran, you should know the fact that the Quran was written by multiple people over a quite long period, which is a weird thing for a book that is supposed to be Almighty Allah's direct word. Especially if we want to follow the common Muslim belief that the Quran is uncreated, meaning it was not simply produced by Allah in Muhammad's time, it existed long before humans. Although Muslims believe that the Quran is Allah's word, it looks very much like it was actually Muhammad's word. But after going through such a long process, did it really protect what Muhammad said? Was it really a divine mission, a divine message? It's very questionable, especially if you look at Quran verses like these that make little sense if the Quran was with Allah forever, even before humans existed. O you who have believed, do not enter the houses of the Prophet except when you are permitted for a meal, without awaiting its readiness. But when you are invited, then enter. And when you have eaten, disperse without seeking to remain for conversation. Indeed, that behavior was troubling the Prophet, and he is shy of dismissing you, but Allah is not shy of the truth. Oh, and when you ask his wives for something, ask them from behind a partition. That is pure for your hearts and their hearts. And it is not conceivable or lawful for you to harm the messenger of Allah, or to marry his wives after him ever. Indeed, that would be in the sight of Allah an enormity. Seriously, what was Allah planning with this Quran first before Muhammad even existed? Why did Allah even say these words? What am I supposed to do with this? Is this really Allah's uncreated direct word for all eternity, for all humankind? I will leave that to you.
Islam is a collection of teachings and practices that were common in Arabia during the time of Muhammad. There were several tribes of Jews preaching monotheism in Arabia. These Jews had the Torah, along with tons of other stories that were recorded in the Talmud and other sources. Many of the stories in these additional sources were based on biblical characters, but they were fictitious. Stories about Abraham being delivered from a fire, or a bird teaching Cain to bury his brother, or Solomon talking to animals. Muhammad heard the stories, and now they're in the Quran. There were also a variety of tales about Jesus and Mary that certain heretical Christian groups believed. Stories about Jesus speaking at birth, Jesus giving life to clay birds, Mary giving birth under a palm tree, and so on. No historian on the planet believes that these stories are authentic, but they were popular in Arabia during the 7th century. Muhammad heard them, and now they're in the Quran. In Surah 18, Allah tells us that Dhul Qarnayn, the Arabic name for Alexander the Great, traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. This was a popular story during Muhammad's lifetime. Muhammad heard it, now it's in the Quran. The Quran even claims that Alexander the Great was a devout Muslim, when we know historically that he was a complete pagan. During Muhammad's time, the Sabians, who are mentioned several times in the Quran, recited a creed, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. Muhammad heard this creed and simply added the words, and Muhammad is his messenger. The Sabians also prayed at all 5 of the times Muslims prayed during their prescribed daily prayers. Some of the Persians believed that after death a paradise of sensual delights awaited them, complete with houris, the perpetual virgins Muslims believe they'll be awarded in paradise. It seems that Muhammad simply took a bunch of the beliefs and practices that were popular in 7th century Arabia, gave them an Islamic twist, and incorporated them into his new religion. The pagans, by the way, thought this was hilarious. They regularly made fun of Muhammad for believing everything he heard, so they called him the ear. Let's read a passage from Ibn Ishaq about Muhammad and one of his critics, a man named Nabtal. I have heard that it was of him that the apostle said, whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal bin al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark ruddy cheeks. He used to come and talk to the apostle and listen to him, and then carry what he had said to the hypocrites. It was he who said, Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it. God sent down concerning him, in Surah 9, verse 61 of the Quran, and of them are those who annoy the prophet and say, he is all ears. Say, good ears for you. He believes in God and trusts the believers and is a mercy for those of you who believe. And those who annoy the apostle of God, for them is a painful punishment. So the pagans could tell that Muhammad was simply adopting stories and practices for Islamic purposes. Not surprisingly, the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, is saturated in paganism and idolatry. During the Hajj, Muslims walk circles around the Kaaba, the cubical shrine that they pray to. They kiss the black stone. They run back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa, and so on. Where did they get these practices? Before Muhammad conquered Mecca, the Kaaba was a center of pagan worship in Arabia. The Kaaba was surrounded by 360 pagan idols. Sahih al-Bukhari, 2478. Narrated Abdullah bin Masud. The Prophet entered Mecca, and at that time there were 360 idols around the Kaaba. He started stabbing the idols with a stick he had in his hand and reciting, and say, truth, i.e. Islamic monotheism or this Quran or jihad against polytheists, has come, and batil, falsehood, i.e. Satan or polytheism, has vanished. This is when Muhammad took control of the Kaaba. But why would he want to take control of a pagan temple and make it the center of Islamic worship? Let's back up a bit. When Muhammad and his followers were in Mecca years earlier, they prayed facing Jerusalem. The pagans prayed facing the Kaaba. Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem like the Jews. You could line up the Kaaba and Jerusalem if you wanted so that you were facing both. But the Qibla, the direction of prayer, was Jerusalem. When Muhammad was in Mecca, he really thought that the Jews were going to accept him as a prophet. The Muslim community eventually moved to Medina, and the Jews could tell immediately that Muhammad was a false prophet because they knew the Torah, and Muhammad only knew some stories that he had heard. He was all ears, remember. But Muhammad couldn't even get those stories right, so the Jews rejected him. And Allah said to Muhammad in Surah 2, verse 144 of the Quran, "Now shall we turn thee to a qibla that shall please thee. Turn then thy face in the direction of the sacred mosque." So Allah's goal in telling Muslims to face the Kaaba was to please Muhammad. It's amazing how much of Islam is dedicated to pleasing the man who was receiving the revelations. Why would facing the Kaaba please Muhammad? Two reasons. One, he was sending the Jews a message. This is what you get for rejecting me. Two, Muhammad had grown up among pagans who prayed facing the Kaaba and all its idols. So praying to the Kaaba was normal for them. It felt right. But how could Muhammad justify praying towards a pagan shrine? Well, just a few verses earlier, in Surah 2, verse 127, Allah declared that the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael. Now that's interesting. If it was built by Abraham and Ishmael, why did Muslims spend more than a decade praying towards Jerusalem? Why does it seem like Muhammad is inventing this as he goes along? One of life's great mysteries. But what evidence do we have that the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael? Absolutely none, apart from the fact that Muhammad said it. That's good enough for Muslims, but it shouldn't be, because Muhammad had absolutely no clue what he was talking about, and I can prove it. Sahih al-Bukhari, 3366. Narrated Abu Dar, I said, "O Allah's Messenger, which mosque was first built on the surface of the earth?" He said, "Al-Masjid al-Haram," at Mecca. I said, "Which was built next?" He replied, "Al-Masjid al-Aqsa," at Jerusalem. I said, "What was the period of construction between the two?" He said, 40 years. According to Muhammad, there was a 40-year gap between the construction of the Kaaba and the temple in Jerusalem. Why is this important? Well, we know when the Jerusalem temple was built. Solomon built it in the 10th century BC. That's more than 1,000 years after Abraham. If Abraham built the Kaaba, he built it more than 1,000 years before Solomon built the Jerusalem temple. But Muhammad said that they were built 40 years apart. So we need to ask our Muslim friends, where did Abraham and Ishmael get their time machine? Because if they didn't have a time machine, Muhammad was wrong, and we can't trust what he says about the construction of the Kaaba. And without Muhammad making up stories about Abraham and Ishmael and the Kaaba, the only evidence we have tells us that Muslims are bowing down to a pagan temple and taking a pilgrimage to a pagan temple and walking circles around a pagan temple. By the way, why do Muslims walk circles around the Kaaba? The pagans walked circles around the Kaaba too. Why did they do that? The Muslim scholar and Quran translator Yusuf Ali, in his commentary on the Quran, has an appendix on ancient forms of pagan worship. He writes, "It will be noticed that the sun and the moon and the 5 planets got identified each with a living deity, god or goddess, with characteristic qualities of its own. The ancients knew about the stars and constellations, but they also knew about 7 heavenly objects that seemed to have their own motions: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They didn't have telescopes yet, so they didn't know about the other planets. According to the pagans, each of these 7 heavenly objects was orbiting the earth, and each was associated with a particular pagan deity. Why did the pagans of Mecca circle the Kaaba 7 times? To honor and worship the 7 planetary deities that they believed were circling the earth. This is as pagan as you can possibly get, and now this thoroughly pagan practice is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But let me guess, if it looks like paganism and walks like paganism and talks like paganism, it must be pure monotheism in disguise, right? When they visit the Kaaba, Muslims do their best to kiss the black stone. That's funny, the pagans of Arabia used to worship stones too. Sahih al-Bukhari, 4376. Narrated Abu Raja al-Utaridi, "We used to worship stones, and when we found a better stone than the first one, we would throw the first stone and take the latter. But if we could not get a stone, then we would collect some earth, i.e. soil, and then bring a sheep, and milk that sheep over it and perform the tawaf around it. When the month of Rajab came, we used to stop the military actions, calling this month the Iron Remover, because we used to remove and throw away the iron parts of every spear and arrow in the month of Rajab. What did the pagans worship? A stone. And they would trade that stone for a better stone to worship. When does that process stop? When you get to the best stone, the black stone at the Kaaba. That's what the pagans did. What do Muslims do when they get to the Kaaba? They kiss the black stone. It's as if Muslims are saying, we want to be as idolatrous as possible, but we're still not idolaters. Interestingly, even Muhammad's companions understood that kissing the black stone was idolatry, but they kept doing it anyway because Muhammad had done it. In Sahih al-Bukhari 1597 we read, narrated Abbas bin Rabi'ah, Umar came near the black stone and kissed it and said, no doubt I know that you are a stone and can neither harm anyone nor benefit anyone. Had I not seen Allah's messenger kissing you, I would not have kissed you. This is Umar, the second rightly guided caliph, saying that he knows he shouldn't be kissing a pagan idol like the black stone, but he does it anyway because Muhammad did it. But there's more idolatry during the Hajj. When the pagans took the pilgrimage to Mecca, they would run back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa. They ran back and forth between them to honor the pagan idols. Yusuf Ali comments on Surah 2, verse 158 of the Quran, the virtue of patient perseverance and faith leads to the mention of two symbolic monuments of that virtue. These are the two little hills of Safa and Marwa, now absorbed in the city of Mecca, and close to the well of Zamzam. Here, according to tradition, the lady Hagar, mother of the infant Ismail, prayed for water in the parched desert, and in her eager quest round these hills, she found her prayer answered and saw the Zamzam spring. Unfortunately, the pagan Arabs had placed a male and a female idol here, and their gross and superstitious rites caused offense to the early Muslims. Now, how do we know that Hagar and Ishmael were ever at these hills? Because Muhammad said it, right? And Muhammad's the guy who thought that Abraham and Solomon lived 40 years apart and that Alexander the Great was a Muslim? Least reliable source of historical information ever. But what do we actually know here? We know that pagans used to run back and forth as part of their idol worship, and the early Muslims knew this as well. Sahih al-Bukhari 3847 narrated Ibn Abbas, to run along the valley between the two green pillars of As-Safa and Al-Marwa mountains was not sunnah, but the people in the pre-Islamic period of ignorance used to run along it and used to say, we do not cross this rain stream except running in great haste. Now, this is devastating to Islam because Ibn Abbas says that this practice was just a pagan practice. It wasn't part of the Sunnah of Muhammad. Notice the commentary at the bottom. This statement of Ibn Abbas is wrong, as most of the religious scholars consider it a Sunnah of the Prophet. Most of the religious scholars, in order to rescue Islam, have to throw Ibn Abbas under the bus. This is getting ridiculous. Sahih al-Bukhari 4496 narrated Asim bin Sulaiman, I asked Anas bin Malik about As-Safa and Al-Marwa. Anas replied, we used to consider going around them a custom of the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. So when Islam came, we gave up going around them. Then Allah revealed, verily, As-Safa and Al-Marwa, two mountains at Mecca, are of the symbols of Allah. So it is not a sin on him who performs Hajj or Umrah pilgrimage of the house, the Kaaba at Mecca. Here again, the early Muslims understood that this was a pagan practice. They said that they stopped doing it when they became Muslims. But Muhammad liked it, so it ended up in the Quran. How much paganism can you fit into one religion? Quite a bit, it seems. And two things are amazing here. First, it's amazing that Muslims, who are swimming in a sea of pagan practices, are deluded enough to think that they're the true champions of monotheism. They're doing everything the pagans did. They just rename it monotheism. Second, the pagans of Arabia were local groups. They weren't going to spread their pagan practices around the world. But Islam has taken the same idolatrous pagan nonsense practiced by the Meccans and spread it around the world. This means that Islam is the greatest source of idolatry and paganism in history. Now, to you Muslims who insist on taking the pilgrimage to Mecca in spite of its pagan roots, I make a simple request. Watch this video, where I talk about the Kaaba and how you can convert your false, pagan worship into something that actually involves God. I'm not sure you'll like it, but it will definitely be an improvement over spending your lives kissing a pagan rock and running around a pagan cube and celebrating the 7 false planetary deities and having no idea that you've been duped. The chief export of Saudi Arabia is not oil. It's paganism and terrorism. Off topic, but I couldn't resist.